Hello, my name is Paul Wolliver. I'm the owner of Pinellas Power Products. This is the installation instruction video for the Honda EU3000i Handy Extended Runtime Remote Fuel Kit. I wanted to touch on a couple of things before we start into the instructions. Number one, if you're watching this video on YouTube and you have any questions or comments, please contact me by my website. You'll see that in the description section of the video below it says any questions or comments, please go to PinellasPowerProducts.com and there's a link. I do not monitor YouTube communications or any chat rooms or anything else. If you need to contact me, on the contact page of my website there is my phone number and my email information. The kit will come in a box. It will consist of some written instructions that tell you basically you've bought the greatest thing since sliced bread. There will be a flash drive that plugs into a USB port, and it'll contain a copy of this video and other relevant information to the kit. There will be the hose clamps. Keep in mind there are two sizes of hose clamps. There's the larger hose clamps for the 1/4 inch hose and the small hose clamps for the 3/16 inch hose. There will be the quick disconnect fittings, the PCV valve, the hose barb, about a dozen zip ties, which I'll go into detail later, roll of Teflon tape, a fuel filter, a fuel pump, a short section of 3/16 hose, a 6-foot section of 1/4 inch hose, and a fuel hose with a prime bulb with quick disconnect fittings on both ends. Before we get started tearing this apart, I'd like to say that the EU3000i Handy is it's very cramped, it's full inside. I give specific measurements on the lengths to cut all the hoses. Stay on those measurements, don't make them longer or shorter. You'll notice that there are several places where I'm going to be adjusting things. Just pay attention when you do it. You'll notice that when I do it, if I notice something isn't quite right, fix it right then. Don't try to put it together because the cabinet has to come off to do it. You'll notice that I send a whole bunch of extra zip ties with it. Don't be afraid to use them. And let's get started. The first step to installing it will be to pull the back two covers off. The screws on both the back covers are captive screws, so they shouldn't fall out on you. Okay, the first thing that I notice is that it's very shiny in here and covered with oil. That's an indicator that he has overfilled it. With this particular engine, when you overfill the oil, it blows into the valve cover area through the crankcase breather line, comes out right through here and fills this cavity with oil. If you do this with my fuel kit installed, you'll reduce the effectiveness of the fuel pump because it will fill the dry side of the pump with oil. An indication you get on this particular generator is if you overfill the oil, there are 3 small holes right here, here, and here. If you see oil or if you run your finger under it and there's oil dripping out of those, you're overfilling it on oil because that's where it'll come out of the vent on my fuel pump. My fuel pump, this is the pulse line, and this is a secondary vent. And if you start overfilling it on oil, it'll fill the pulse line up, and oil will start dripping out through here and into the bottom of the cases. At any rate, There are 5 screws in the back cover. They all are held on with a number 3 Phillips head. And they are identical. Then to take the back cover off, do you have your flashlight? There's a hose clamp right here for the air intake. You'll loosen up this hose clamp and then slide this down. So the first thing I'm going to do is loosen up this hose clamp a few times. This is the one we took off with the hose clamp. This, we could slide back on right now, but it's actually easier to video it with that out of the way. The first thing we're going to do is pull the valve cover off. So to get the valve cover off, we've got to pull this housing off. There are 4 screws that hold the front cover on. They are identical to the 5 screws that held the back cover on. Then there's a rubber cover in the end of the fuel selector valve. You notice that there's a dimple in one end of it. In the off position, the dimple faces to the left. And there's a Phillips head screw. Over here is the main wiring harness for the on-off switch and the indicator. What you do is depress this tab right here and it unplugs. We'll turn it up now instead of unsnapping it ahead of time. I wanted to take a moment to give a little bit better detail to how this side cover comes off. This cover I didn't show very clearly in the original video. There are 3 tabs along the bottom of it. If you just pull up just a little bit with a flat blade screwdriver, you release each of the tabs one at a time. And now you can unplug it and you're done. You could wait till now to unsnap it and that cover comes off. The top center, there's a little red plastic cover. Just lift that out with a screwdriver. You'll notice there are 3 tabs on this cover. One is larger than the other 2. The one that's larger goes toward the fuel cap so that this little notch faces the back of the generator and it won't go in any other way. There's 2 Phillips head screws that hold this plastic cover on the back of the handle. They are identical to the 4 screws that held the front cover on and the 5 screws that held the rear cover on. There's a single chrome screw under that plastic cover that we removed earlier, and that's clearly different. Then there are 2 large chrome screws here in the back. These are the same as the large chrome screw in the top. Then there's 2 small Phillips head screws in the side. These are identical to the screws that held the front cover and the back cover and the beauty cover on the handle. There are 2 screws in the very front, and these are different. Number 1, they're just a little bit shorter than all the others, and number 2, the head is just slightly smaller. But the easiest way to spot them is the fact that the screw is shorter. Next, you'll have to pull the heat shield off. The heat shield is held on with a series of clamps. And one is hidden right here. You can pull it out through that hole in the front. So a total of 5 clamps. Now you can see the valve cover that has to be removed. First thing we'll do is pull the breather hose out. We'll just go ahead and pull it all the way through. So we're going to be removing this breather hose to replace it with a different one. You'll notice that the breather hose goes through a black rubber grommet. Make sure that that black rubber grommet does not get lost. This is the breather hose. If you do not have a universal joint socket like this to get in at that bottom bolt, you can actually rock up on the engine. The engine is rubber mounted, so it moves around. So you can flex it around to get a little bit more room down in that corner. All 4 bolts on the valve cover are identical. The holes in the cylinder head are a blind hole, so you'll notice that the threads do not go all the way to the end. This was definitely overfilled. You'll notice there's oil all over in the valve cover area. I'm going to replace the valve cover gasket. The kits do come with a replacement valve cover gasket. If when you pull your valve cover off, if the valve cover gasket looks in perfect condition, you can reuse it. And keep the valve cover that's included in the kit for later on to do a valve adjustment someday. Okay, we're removing the valve cover so that we can remove the PCV valve from the breather area. We'll be putting another PCV valve downline from the fuel pump. On these Honda valve covers, the breather plate is just pressed into the valve cover. Sometimes they come out easy, sometimes they don't. What I'm trying to do is hit it against the countertop so that this flange hits the countertop and the valve cover breather area is starting to drop out. And you can see it starting to come out just a little bit. And it's starting to come out of there. So now, and if it doesn't come out of there easy, you just take a small screwdriver like this one and just start getting it under the edge and just slowly wiggling it up. And there's no way to predict whether yours will come out easy or difficult. It's just the luck of the draw. Just for the purpose of explanation, if you do have one that comes out with great difficulty and it messes up the edge along here, you'd lay the edge on the steel surface and just straighten it out of any ripples that you may have put in it. So what we're doing is removing the PCV valve, and that's this little reed valve here. And we're going to go ahead and take the guide and turn it out of the way too, so that we can press our replacement breather hose into the valve cover area. Okay, so now the PCV valve is always open. You want to compress this reed stop so that when you push it back in, the reed stop does not hit the back of the valve cover area. So you can either wiggle it back and forth to try and break that pop rivet out of it, or just compress it down. if you lay it on a solid surface, you can tap it down pretty flat. And then we just press the breather plate back into place. You notice it went right in. My kits come with a genuine Honda replacement valve cover gasket. Incidentally, if your original gasket is in nice shape and you do not have to replace it, it makes your job a lot easier, because when you put the new gasket on, it has a tendency to slide and move around on you. I'm going to use just a couple drops of gasket sealer, not because I need them to seal it, but because it keeps it from sliding around on you. And it just makes your job a lot easier to assemble it. What I'll do is set this on, and then I'm going to start this bolt and this one because that's the easiest two to start. Okay, I just had to move it a little bit, so it's best to pull it apart and make sure that the gasket didn't walk on you. Okay, now we'll go ahead and put the heat shield back on this side because we're done under this side. flashlight. Okay, it's easy to tell when this cover is just not quite perfect, and just take the extra time that it takes to get it perfectly in there. You'll notice that there's a slight notch in the heat shield that goes around this screw tab. But when it's really in there perfectly, all the seams will line up. And in the back here, there's a tab that slides into this side of the housing, and then this little tab goes over an indentation in it. But now all the clip places line up. So we'll start putting the clips in place. And then for the tricky one. And that's that one. And now I'm going to go ahead and put the red plastic cover on. It does not have to go on now, but a lot of people feel squeamish about having the whole generator apart at the same time, so we could go ahead and put this plastic cover back in place now. Here on the top, both sides have a loop, and the cover that we just removed goes under the other one. So we can put 4 of the screws in place now, and that'll hold this cover back in place. Probably as good a place as any to take a short break. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is pull off this side. In order to pull off this side though, we'll have to pull this cover off first. As you remember, when we pulled off the valve cover, it was full of oil. So when we tip it up on end to pull that cover off, oil will drain out unless we put the breather line back in place. So we're going to put the breather line back in place here just temporarily. You'll notice there's a white paint mark on the breather hose. And I just put the breather hose right back in where it started. This is the breather hose here, and that's the spark plug lead wire. Now we're going to go ahead and take a pair of clamps and clamp the breather hose off. What this is going to do is keep oil from running out into the back of the generator when we stand it up on it. Okay. Taking this side off is the same as the other side. Just pry out a little bit. And we unsnap it. And we take the 4 screws out of this side panel. Remember, the screw that's up here we took out earlier, and it is the one that's different. It looks very similar, but it is slightly different. We'll cover that when we go to install them again. Stick your finger in the gas cap and pull out the screen, and then pull out the lanyard that holds the gas cap, so that now we can get this cover off. I'm just going to put the gas cap on so that we don't fill this room full of fumes while we're working. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and pull the breather hose out of here again, because this is the original stock one and we're going to be replacing it. Okay. In the kit, there's a 6-foot section of 1/4-inch rubber hose. You're going to need to be able to cut the rubber hose into sections. The first section that you're going to cut is going to be 6 1/8 of an inch. You'll notice I said 6 1/8 of an inch, not roughly 6 inches. This little EU 3000i handy is real tight under the cowling, and there's really very little room for error. Look at the fuel hose, and this one is easier to spot. There was a white line on the stock breather hose, and it was about 3/8 of an inch long. So we're going to push this breather hose in to the valve cover to the E where it says fuel, and that way it'll be in about the same length as the stock one was. Do you have the flashlight? Thanks. I'm just going to push it in. You'll be able to video it once it's in. Okay. Now you can see that it's pushed in. And it takes some doing. But this is the hose that we pushed in. And I've actually pushed it in a little bit past where I'd hoped to get it to. Too far is not going to cause a problem. Not far enough would cause a problem. So it's all the way into the letter L. As you remember, it said fuel, F-U-E-L. I was hoping to get it into the E. And we're going to take the new PCV valve and slide it down into the fitting. As you remember, the original stock hose went over this. The PCV valve is going to go inside of it, and it's a fairly snug fit. So what you'll do is take a razor knife. I've trimmed it down a little bit ahead of time, but I didn't want to trim it all the way down because I wanted to do it on camera. But you're just going to scrape. You'll notice that there's a hose barb. And what you're doing is taking just the edge of the hose barb off to make it slightly smaller. And with these injection molded air boxes, no two generators are going to be absolutely identical on the inside, because Honda wasn't worried about the inside size, they were worried about the outside size. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to squeeze it down to where the flare goes all the way against the inlet on the airbox. And we're going to take this hose, push it onto this side of the T-fitting. Like this. The next section of hose we need to cut is going to be 23 3/4 of an inch long. So it's going to be right between the 4 and the T on this particular hose. The hose that we're doing right now is an air line. It's not gasoline, so it doesn't have to have clamps on it. If this were to leak or to come off, the pump would not pump, but it would not leak fuel. So you're going to go up the front of the fuel tank, feed it between the fuel tank and this mount bracket. Incidentally, the kits come with about a dozen zip ties. We're going to zip tie this one to the choke, or excuse me, fuel shutoff cable. And this is just to hold it in place. I'm not going to zip tie it down real tight just yet. Pay attention as you're doing this. You don't want anything to hit the recoil rope. And that's what the zip ties are for, is to tie everything up nice and snug. Okay. You'll temporarily slide the fuel knob in place and just make sure that the fuel is all the way off, which it is. So now we're going to remove this hose. Can you see that with the camera? You might have to come around back.
Yeah.
Okay, this hose goes from the fuel selector valve to the carburetor. So we're going to squeeze on this Corbin clamp, push that out of the way. Then I've got to come over here. And then we'll squeeze on this Corbin clamp. And slide it backward. And that's the hose with both clamps on it, so we don't have to go searching for the clamps, which is good. Okay. Okay, we're going to need to take two sections of the 1/4 inch hose. One of them will be 7 inches long exactly. The other will be 5.5 inches exactly. It's right down the middle of the 3. The kit comes with a fuel pump. It is a genuine Mikuni fuel pump. And this is the screen that I had touched on earlier. If you overfill the oil level, this is the screen where you'll see oil coming out of it. Okay. Take the T-fitting included in the kit and put one on either side, one of the hoses on either side of the T-fitting. Okay. And now if you go over to the generator, the fuel pump is going to sit right down here. This is going to be the fuel inlet side. So if you look at the fuel pump, you notice that there's an arrow pointing in. Put the 7-inch hose onto the fuel inlet side. Now these hoses here do carry gasoline, so these are the ones that we are going to have to put hose clamps on when it's all assembled. And I'm just putting them on loose for right now. next section of hose that you're going to cut is going to be 16 inches long. Okay, so with the back side of the pump facing you, the fuel inlet port is going to be the top one. So that's where the fuel input line is going to go. And this is the hose that you cut to 7 inches long. So we're going to go ahead and tighten down this hose clamp. The hose clamp on the 5.5 inch long needs to face straight down where the clasp portion of it points the same direction as the 16 inch hose. Then the clamp on the 16 inch hose needs to point in the direction of the 7 inch hose that goes to the fuel pump. And then the hose clamp that is on the 7 inch hose goes straight up. Might be a little bit confusing, but that's necessary to get everything to fit. And what we're going to do is we're going to slide this hose onto the fuel selector valve where this end used to go. And then we're going to tighten down the hose clamp. I'm going to rotate the hose clamp to where it faces upward because that'll be the easiest place to get at it. Put a little bit of oil on the end of that hose, get it on there. If you don't have a bottle of oil, just take the dipstick out and stick the dipstick in the end of the hose and run it around a little bit. Keep in mind gasoline is going to be going through this hose, so it's going to wash the excess oil off very quickly. You see the flashlight? I just need to be able to see in there. We'll get a camera close up on it once I get it in place. Here's the way I'm doing it. I'm grabbing it with a pair of needle nose pliers from right under here and pushing in on it. Okay, I'm going to try to do it just a little bit further. That's it. Okay. Now if you'll notice over here on this side, this is just a little bit snug. We're going to rock the engine over. Just push on the engine and it'll rock over. And now there's just a little bit of play where your hose assembly goes above the recoil start housing. And there's a recessed area in the bottom of this. Try and slide the hose clamp into place. Okay, you can see where the hose clamp is now. It may be easier to take a screwdriver and push it on. You notice that what I did was I squeezed it to where it clicked one tooth on the hose clamp. That way I didn't have to try and get it started. It was a little bit more difficult to get it over the fitting. However, Okay. Just make sure you don't push this up. If you go too far up, it opens up the fuel, and then you'd have gasoline running into your fuel pump while you were working on it. You'd have a bit of a mess to clean up. Okay. The next hose that we're going to put in place is going to be the fuel output hose. The fuel output hose is going to be a section of 1/4 inch hose, 6 5/8 of an inch long. We're going to use an adapter to go from 1/4 inch fuel hose to 3/16 fuel hose. You'll notice that the stock fuel hose Honda uses is 1/4 inch on one end, 3/16 on the other. So then included in the kit is a short section of 3/16 fuel hose. You'll need to cut a section of that exactly 6.5 inches long. Incidentally, you're going to get a whole slew of hose clamps. There are two sizes of hose clamps. There are the larger ones, and those go on all the 1/4 inch hose clamp or hoses. Then there are going to be some small ones, and those are for the 3/16 hose. The 3/16 hose will slide it up onto the carburetor. Once again, I'm going to take a hose clamp and just squeeze one click. Oh, that's a bunch. If you do go too far, just grab it with a pair of pliers and rock it sideways. And this goes right onto the carburetor where we removed the stock hose from. All I'm doing is squeezing the hose clamp right now. So I'll let you get the camera in there in a minute. Okay. Here's the hose clamp that I just squeezed on. Can you get a good shot of that with the camera? Okay, yeah. This right here is the hose clamp. This is going to run down right below the recoil start housing, and we're going to turn the hose clamps to where they don't hit the recoil start housing and cause any problems there. This goes on the output of the fuel pump. Another hose clamp for that. Now what we're going to do, each of these webs have 3 fingers on it. The one that's right behind this clamp, we're going to loop a tie wrap around the center finger, and we're going to use that to hold this in place nicely. I'll show you on one of these. I'm going to push it into one and pull it around. So that's what it's going to do. But it's going to go on the one that's hidden from the camera here. And once I get it in place, you'll be able to try and get a shot of it. The whole idea is that this hose should be able to be pulled back and forth without wiggling that clamp. Now, this is the pulse line, which was the first hose that we put in place. Now we can start snugging up on these tie wraps. We don't want it to touch the recoil hose or recoil cord at all. And keep in mind that the pulse line just carries air. So it does not need to be clamped at both ends. You want to just stick your hand in here and make sure that the bend on that hose, in fact the bend on every hose, should be a nice smooth radius bend. There should be none of the bends that are kinking the hose flat anywhere. You're going to get about a dozen of these small tie wraps. Go ahead and use them. I'm going to go ahead and move those clamps because I don't like the fact that they're pushing the fuel output line out here, because we need the fuel input line to be able to move back and forth. And with that fuel output line down there, that could create some problem when we go to put it all back together again. This clamp too, because the fuel input line is rubbing against it when you go to slide it in place, and on the last step of this it'll become difficult to slide it in where it needs to go. We don't want to make it any more difficult than it really has to be. I'm going to put this hose clamp facing inside. The reason this hose needs to be able to move through here like this is when we put the hose onto the front cover, we're going to have the front cover out here, so the hose will be pulled out like this. Then we're going to slide the front cover into place, and the hose needs to be able to push back. Otherwise we'll have an extremely difficult time trying to get everything together at the last bit. I'm going to spin this hose clamp around the other way also. So now there's nothing to snag on this hose when you move it in and out. So now what we need to do is look over everything and make sure that the recoil start rope is not hitting any of our tie wraps or our hoses or anything else. Okay. All the gas lines have clamps on them now. Okay. The fuel inlet port is going to go on the front cover below the fuel selector valve. We put the covers on it. Number one, the kit comes with a fuel filter. The Honda EU3000i Handy is just a really tight, compact generator, so it's difficult to put the fuel filter in under the casings. The other problem is, if you put the fuel filter inside the casing, it's difficult to get at it to service it, so it's not much good. On the EU3000i Handy, what I would suggest is on the fuel hose that comes with the kit, there's an arrow on the prime bulb. You'll notice that there's also an arrow on the fuel filter. I'm a big fan of fuel filters, so I do recommend you using one. It's going to be a little bit obnoxious out here where people can see it, but at least you can see the fuel filter and you can service it if it gets clogged up. So that covers that portion of it. The next thing is on the pulse line. You can either run the pulse line right between this mount bracket and the fuel tank, or you can move this zip tie back to here and run the pulse line through this recessed area in the fuel tank. I like running it down here. The next thing is I moved the fuel output hose down to here, and I put this zip tie on the back bracket instead of the front. And that's simply to create more room out here. Because remember, when you go to install the front cover, you need to pull this hose out so that you can attach it here and then push it back in. The next thing is the pulse line where it goes between the fuel tank, or excuse me, the area between the fuel tank and the pulse line. When you put the covers on, you're going to have a nice 3-finger gap. Remember, when you put the back cover on, this hose has to go in that gap. So make sure that you've got enough room. If you cut the hoses the exact length that I described in the kit, you'll have enough room on this one. If this is pushed in tight, that means you got to take some of this and push it this way to where it has a big enough gap. The next thing is when I put the pulse line into the valve cover, you notice it took quite a bit of diligence to get it in there. You absolutely must get the pulse line into the valve cover between 3/8 and 1/2 inch. If you just push it up against it, your kit's not going to work. I have honestly had people with my early version of the 3000 IS, the electric start, just push it up kind of close as they put it because it was hard to get it in, but that won't work. Some things are difficult, some things are easy. Just take your time when you install the kit and be diligent about it. If you do everything correctly, it'll work perfectly the first time and you won't have to do anything over. Anytime something doesn't look right, stop and fix it. Kind of like with the heat shield on the other side, when it's perfect, it'll slide right in there. And if it doesn't slide right in, something is wrong. Little 3000i Handy is a little bit more compact than some of the generators, so it's a little bit pickier on putting the fuel kit in. But if you just take your time and do it right, you'll be pleased with the results. As long as it works perfectly. You can always lie to your friends and tell them you did it in 10 minutes. Incidentally, when you're running off the stock tank, the vent will need to be in the open position or on, and when you're running off the remote tank, the vent will need to be in the closed position or off. Okay. So that's in the off position, so we're going to be running it off the remote tank here in a few minutes. So now we have a vent line on the valve cover, so we don't have to put our temporary vent line on when we lock it up. The other side goes on the same way. They just snap into place. Do you remember the large silver screws? One went top center. And the other two go in the back. Remember, the two screws that go here in the top are the oddball ones, slightly shorter, slightly smaller head, and all the rest of them. There's a notch on this. It faces the back of the generator, and one of the tabs is larger than the other two. That faces the gas cap, so that snaps down into place. On the front cover, the fuel inlet fitting is going to go right here. So we'll go ahead and drill a hole for that now. You'll notice there's a little bit of sound deadening material on the inside. Just fold it back out of the way. Not sure how much good sound deadening material does on a plastic cover anyway. Sneak past here. If you don't have a reamer, round file, or go ahead and drill it. Thinking that that's just slightly smaller than a ½ inch, don't go all the way to a ½ inch drill bit, because then it'll fit slightly loose, and I like it to be a nice snug bit in here. There's a roll of Teflon tape included in the kit. When you go to wrap the threads, do not go over the ends of the threads. If you go like that, this piece is going to get sheared off and it will make its way into the fuel system. So just make sure that you don't go past the ends of the threads when you're wrapping the tape. Okay, I am going to face the barbs inward. The main reason is if they're facing straight down, it's kind of hard to hook the fuel line on and off. If they're facing straight up, then the fuel line is possibly going to kink, and if they're facing sideways, they're going to possibly run into the handle. So if they just make them face inward right now, and less to adjust later on. Okay. So now we'll just have the sound deadening material, which, as you can tell, is not fastened on super tight. It's just kind of stuck on there with dum-dum. Okay. There's a wiring harness right here that we're going to plug in. That's it. And we've got plenty of fuel line here, and as you remember, as long as you've got enough fuel line sticking out to make your connection, you're good. It's just less fuel line that you have to try and push back in there. So I'm going to trim off about the last inch of that, because this is actually plenty. Just a little bit more. If you put this on and you find, or you start to put it on and you find you're comfortable with how much room you've got, you can always trim off a little bit more too. Keep in mind that it's easier to trim off more later on than it is to put it back on if you've accidentally trimmed off too much. So I don't recommend you getting too aggressive on how much you trim off. Okay, shine the camera in there. Once again, the screws that go in the front cover from here out are identical. There is a little tab on the fuel selector knob, so it'll only go one way. If you're trying to put it on and it won't go, rotate it a quarter of a turn at a time until it does go, or look where the tab is and where the notch is and simply line them up. The plug that goes in again has an indentation on it. The indentation will face to the left when the fuel is shut off. Now, I'm going to put the back cover on. The arrow on this faces up if you remove this. There's a gap right here in this tab that this goes into so that you can get the clocking right. That way there's only one choice as to how it goes. And what we're going to have to do is feed the intake line over this and then hook onto this, and we'll tighten down the clamp on that. I'm going to wipe out some of that oil where somebody overfilled it. These Hondas are very, very picky on the oil level. If it's too low, it'll stall the motor. If it's too high, it'll blow it out. Now remember, you're going just behind the pulse hose on this. Take your flashlight, let me show you something. There's a row of tabs on the bottom here that have to be inside the inner cover. So you just pop the outer cover out just a little bit with a screwdriver. Unfortunately, you can't set that in first and then rock it in because you can't get the breather line or the intake line in place. So you gotta kind of snap them in place one at a time with a screwdriver afterward. Flashlight. Did I shut the camera off on you?
No.
Okay. That's just the intake hose clamp. Just make sure that this is all the way in place. That's in. And we've got the beauty cover for the handle. That's held on with the last two screws. air filter back in place. As you're doing all the covers, just make sure that all the tabs are slid into place and so forth. If you get everything into place just right, you won't be fighting it. Incidentally, if you have trouble getting this back cover in place, because the intake hose that goes on the back of the carburetor has got not enough room between the pulse line, which goes from the valve cover in. Don't pull it out of the valve cover. Pull it to where it pulls this end out, because keep in mind there's a loop that runs from here and runs into a loop into the fuel pump. So take and pull on this side here. Let me pull that back off and show you real quick. This is the hose right here. You don't want to pull it out of the valve cover. If you pull it out of the valve cover, the fuel system won't work. It won't pump. So if you need more hose, you'll pull from the part that goes around the side. Okay, that should get it.